The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
First of all, very good evening to all of you. It's a real honor for me to be here at the 2022 ETHOS conversation today. And I thank ETHOS Institute for inviting me to speak to you and also to listen to you. It's not only a privilege to address all of you, but I also hope to learn from you as we engage in a dialogue later on. Because as you know, this issue of race, religion, the intersection with public policy, and the way in which we use all of these as strengths, harnessing them together to build our nation is not only a oftentimes difficult conversation, but I think one that is also changes with different generations and different times as we embrace and we look at the challenges ahead of us. The theme, I think, for today's seminar is particularly relevant: religion, public policy, nation building. And if I looked at the publicity material, and there's a byline that says what one believes has a profound impact not only on the person, but also on his or her community. And I thought that very aptly summarizes the relevance and importance of the issue we face. In Singapore, as you know, we are a secular state. But at the same time, religion and religious organizations undeniably play a very important role in the entire makeup of our social fabric as we construct our social fabric and we live with one another. And I believe that race, religion are issues which are essential to nation building and progress. Religion, public policy, and the progress of our nation are matters which I believe are deeply intertwined. And speaking for myself, I will say that our not so distant history, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and the recent world events of today really underscore to me how important it is that we must get this right. So this evening, allow me to share some of my own personal reflections on this topic and also my own experience and how I feel, we, in my capacity at MCCY, look at engaging with and bringing harmony to the different races and different religious communities in Singapore. I think it's important as we embark on this topic to start looking at ourselves introspectively, our local context, our own history, our unique set of challenges. This has undeniably shaped our own approach to race and religion. We are one of the most religiously diverse countries in the world. Many surveys and many reports will tell you that. On top of that, we sit in the middle of Southeast Asia, which is itself the most religiously diverse region in the world. In Singapore, the recent 2020 census tells us that 19% of our population are Christians, like most of you are out here, if not all. But we also have a sizable Buddhist, Muslim, Taoist, Hindu, and Sikh community. At the same time, about 20%, and that number has grown slightly over the last decade, from 17 to 20% of Singaporeans are non-religious. It's a topic I'll come back to in a moment. But I think the immediate takeaway is that the religious diversity we have in Singapore, coupled with the strong influence that religion has on our own individual values, our beliefs, what drives us, is a reason, one key reason why religious organizations play such an important role in our social fabric. But I think all of us will know as we go back in history that diversity can also come with challenges. And in the short history of our nation, I mentioned it just now, several decades ago, 50s, 60s, even in the early 70s, it's a recent, not so recent, and recent reminders of how precious and fragile our racial and religious harmony is. And that's why when we started in 1965, we chose this path deliberately. We came out from Malaysia, and it was probably the natural thing to do to have been very much like what Malaysia is today, with a very sharp racial focus on many of the things they do, including politics and policies as well. But we chose a path that did not eliminate diversity. We chose a path, in fact, to bring ethnic and religious minorities together, to adopt language, norms, and attitudes of the majority group. We didn't choose to do that. We respected and we kept the different identities, all Singaporean, but behind it, the different ethnicities, the different cultures, practices, beliefs were retained. We embarked on this path celebrating our diversity as a strength, while at the same time having sense of shared belonging and identity. It was not easy. We constantly have had to work hard at this, and in part of my research for tonight's engagement and dialogue, I looked at the previous speeches that were made in other years for the same dialogue, and I think this is a constant refrain that does keep coming up, that we have to constantly work hard to preserve this space for our community, to ensure that everyone is entitled to practice without fear or favor their own particular belief. At the same time, ensuring that we maintain a common set of values and language and practices at the same time that is common to all of us. So not easy, but something that we have done for many years. In Singapore, when we talk about religion, public policy, I think we have to first look at the macro and then a bit of the micro. So if you permit me, I'll spend a bit of time setting out what I believe is the framework as to how we manage in Singapore religion. In fact, race and religion are very often, they go hand in hand, and how we also manage the micro aspects of this. Beginning with the macro, I think you can't go bigger than the Constitution. So, we start with Article 15 of the Constitution. It sets out as a basic charter, basic item to our formation that every person in Singapore has a right to profess, practice, and propagate the religion. That is a very important starting point because, fundamental as it may sound, not every country has this basic guarantee. So we start with this basic guarantee, constitutionally guaranteeing everyone in Singapore to be able to practice, profess, propagate religion. So none of this is against the Constitution. In fact, we are obliged to ensure that we do that. In addition to this, there's a framework. There's a legislative legal framework that we use to look at how we can safeguard the common spaces. Legislation, as I'll say later on, can't tell you what to do. It can only tell you what not to do. It can't tell you how to build a good community, but it can guard the outer spaces. So we have the MRHA, the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, and more recently you would have heard that we will be looking at the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act, both of which I believe go hand in hand. We have the Societies Act, Sedition Act, we have the ISA, which you know. All of these were necessary levers to ensure that we guarantee what Article 15 guarantees we can put in place, and any attempt to try to infringe, denigrate, or attack another religion, we frown upon that very firmly. So the state plays a role in doing that, ensuring that all religions and all persons who practice that religion, that faith, have the space to do so. And the framework in law makes that come true. In addition to that, where necessary, the state also actively intervenes to ensure that there is no hate speech. We don't allow people to stand on a soapbox and denigrate another religion, much like what happens surprisingly often, actually, in many other countries. You just take the recent examples in France as one example, and that itself then led to bloodshed. So we are very mindful of this. And so a few years ago, there was a Watain concert. I'm sure many of you would remember that occasion. We in government felt that we had to intervene, to step in and ensure that you don't go on stage and in the name of music, make slanderous and scandalous remarks about religion and use the cross, the crucifix in a way which is derogatory. So all of that, is part of what we do to guard that space. I was reading a paper recently. I met someone and he sent me his dissertation, and one of the footnotes caught my eye. And the footnote was this. Netflix, all of you know Netflix, right? So Netflix has been around for about 20 odd years. And there have been something like, I forget the exact number, but 12 or 15 occasions where Netflix, I think 12 occasions, 9 or 12 occasions where Netflix was asked to remove content And 5 of that came from Singapore. Not to tell you that, we are so proactive and interventionist, but it tells you that as a government, we take quite seriously what is put out there in the public space. And to the extent that, it infringes on and denigrates, derogates, makes scandalous remarks about other religions, we actively intervene to protect the space because we believe that's important. And that's how we see the state's role in this, ensuring that the common spaces are available and that no one, it's not just allows people to propagate and profess their faith, but also to be able to ensure that that space is not damaged by this kind of hate speech. On top of these harder structures, there are some soft structures as well. I mentioned just now that we can't legislate against, we can legislate against offensive speech, hate speech, and so on, but you can't tell people how to be more tolerant and grow harmony. You can't do that by legislation at least. So softer, more micro, more organic, and more community-based structures are necessary. So for instance, Bishop will recall that he and I are on the National Steering Committee on Race and Religion. That's something that we use to bring together teachings, learning points, exchange thinking, exchange thoughts very regularly on race, religion issues that arise. I chair the National Integration Council. You heard Dr. Tong say that earlier. We also have the interracial, interreligious organizations, IRO, IRCC. We have the local grassroots structure, interfaith groups, many of them working with the local ROs and generating relationships at the ground level, the community level through these softer structures. And that's particularly important because much as you might want to say that, we have a race and religion policy, we have Article 15 and so on, it rings pretty hollow if in practice, in a daily lived experience, people don't come together and people don't practice it and people don't stand side by side, And very often we see real life examples of this. I see a mosque set up next to a church, mosque next to a temple, and so on. And people come in and there is a lot of give and take in the way in which you look at local humanity issues as well. On top of that, that our political leaders often appear at religious events, organizations, and we're invited there. Many of you know that I'm a practicing Roman Catholic, and I attend many of the non-Catholic events, and on occasion also take part in it. Not so much that I believe in it, but because I believe it's a sign of respect to the organizers and to the event itself that I'm present, and it's a mark of respect. It's what I believe myself as my own faith. Of course, it's personal for me. I don't impose it on the work that I do. And certainly I can't because we're secular and we're a secular government. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that I don't also take part and attend. And I think this is the way in which we, in hard and soft ways, try to foster that relationship. Other levers, if I may just cite a few more, we believe in constant dialogue. I think many of you know that I've seen on the Zoom camera many familiar faces from these dialogues too. And I think that's important because much as we say, again, in theory that we want to guard that common space, what we do about it is also important. So occasions like this evening, or other dialogues that we have, formal and informal ones, on sometimes deeply divisive issues. For example, the PM's announcements on the lifting of restrictions on the tudung wearing last year at the NDR was not the product of something overnight and somebody woke up one morning and decided that this is what we should do. But really, it's a product of many, many years of discussion, debate, dialogue, agreement, disagreement. In some cases, more tense. In other cases, less tense. But I think this is the way in which you should garner understanding and build mutual understanding as well. Same has been the case for the divisive issues like 3778. So there is a legal issue behind it, there is a moral issue behind it, and there are also different views from the different religious groups. All of these I cite as examples to show you that in government we believe that relationship is vital. Having that structure, hard and soft, having that dialogue, having the ability to say that we know where our limits are, we know what the different views are, is important. And it's not just for sort of moral or divisive issues like this, but if you remember, go about 20 years back, we had a very tense discussion on whether we should proceed with the casino or not. I don't know whether you all remember that, but the Christians had a view, the Muslims had a view. In the end, we took a decision on this, having heard parties, and the government of the day then decided that we'll move ahead with it and had to explain the position. So it's religion and religious practices, beliefs don't stop policy per se, but they are very much taken into account and very much considered the context of how overall policy is eventually decided upon. One other angle and example of this close collaboration is really in the active cooperation that government has with many religious organizations in the context of what we do in the community through education. There are Anglican, Methodist, and Catholic schools. I come from a Catholic school myself, and I know that besides the Catholic teachings, there's a national curriculum that is followed. Partnership also in the context of providing social welfare through mechanisms and structures which benefit society as at large and as a whole, and not just limited to members of a particular religion. And how we do that, how we run that through state funds, but administered by the religious groups. It's an approach that has worked well for us over many years. Working with the organizations, having this broad structure and the more micro ones as well. But I go back to the point I made earlier. We just have to look around and see how difficult today has been. Today meaning present times in the context of other parts of the world. I mentioned France earlier. You just have to look closer to home in Sri Lanka, in India, even in Indonesia, in a political setting where religion interfered with what Ahok tried to do in the context of that election, shows that we can't take this for granted. We can never take this for granted. Racial and religious fault lines are a soft target for exploitation. And in today's context, social media has become also fertile ground for this. Sometimes more extreme, which we work with the platforms to curtail, to cut down, to limit its circulation. But often there are also very soft, sometimes almost unnoticeable influences. Soft, pernicious, but seeks to undermine and destabilize communities. And in government, we are concerned about this. There is a deep concern that these influences, and in the days when you could ensure that your Sunday school teachings or your asatizas, you come and teach, right values. Now, the internet is the teacher, and to a young person, you can access anything. And one of the concerns we have, which I think you might share as well, is that with the COVID measures and people are not coming to service, not coming to mass, you're accessing it online, and you really wonder what is accessed online as well. So all these are newer challenges that we have. And these new challenges remind us, A, that we can't take religious harmony for granted. B, we must always, I go back to my earlier point, we must always make sure that we get it right, because it's so important for us as a nation for social cohesion, but also as we progress as a nation. And finally, it's a stark reminder that we do have to update these compacts as well. How we approach racial and religious harmony and cohesion 20, 30 years ago is got to be completely different from where it is today. The values are the same, objectives are the same, but the modality and the way of engagement is going to be different. So those are my thoughts on how I see public policy, how we make policy, what are the structures around it, and the relevance of religion and religious organizations within it. I'll just, as I close off, spend a few minutes on what I think are some of the key considerations for us as we look at our policies. How do we at once embrace diversity, manage the tensions as they inevitably arise, and also how do we build on this? What are the core principles we need to build on to look at the next bound for our country? I think broadly, three very important considerations. The first is to ensure that we are faithful to, but not a slave to, meritocracy. Meritocracy has its advantages. It focuses on individual merit, performance. No one is discriminated, and no one is disadvantaged on extraneous considerations, race, language, religion, gender, and so on. But at the same time, we must proactively put in social safety nets to ensure that as we have vulnerable segments in our society, that they continue to be looked after. Because if they don't, and there is a generational mobility issue, then this will undermine social cohesion. The second is our broadly what we've been discussing today, which is multiculturalism, a key feature of the Singaporean society, recognizing our unique value proposition as a country, but really looking at how we not just say it, but practice it. So I mentioned just now daily lived experiences, what we do in our schools, in national service, in our neighborhoods, workplaces, ensuring that there are daily meaningful interactions with one another. In my ministry, I use, we look after a whole diverse range of stakeholders, but I see those really as a means to an end, whether it's in sports or arts, in the youth, in religion, community events. All of these give us an opportunity to build meaningful relationships, to bring people together, foster mutual trust. And the more we can do that, the more difficult it will be to engender distrust. Very often I find, and many young people also tell me that they don't really interact so much. I think COVID has been one reason for that. But really, besides COVID, I think the trend has been there. People are a lot more engaged on their devices. Everyone is, on their mobile phones and communicating through mobile phones. It's makes for less of interaction at a personal level. And I think this is something that we have to try and find a way around, because the less we see each other, the more we stereotype each other. And the more likely it is that we'll form views which may or may not be representative of the particular person, and certainly not of the group at large. Finally, I think the key driver to why we've been successful really has been secularism. I spoke about it earlier. This really means how government's policy decisions are kept distinct from religious priorities. Distinct doesn't mean ignored. What I mean to say is we should never allow religion to be politicized. It should never become a tool to garner votes. It should never become a tool to be divisive. Secularism also ensures that policies can be fair to all, aimed at benefiting all Singaporeans without looking at whether we favor one religion or otherwise. And indeed, if we extend that principle, whether we favor one race or one gender or otherwise, ensuring that there's neutrality. Neutrality is not the same as being agnostic or being atheist. And I want to explain that. Our approach to religion in government is to look at, understand, respect, and give space to religion to profess, to operate. And we understand that this is the faith of the community. Being agnostic is to not believe. We don't do that. We believe that being neutral is different from being agnostic. And indeed, it is neither possible nor desirable in Singapore for a government to be agnostic. Religious organizations, as I said, play a very important role in our social fabric. And it is incumbent upon the government to build up these relationships through collaboration, cooperation. Some are more formal and some are more informal. I mentioned some of them earlier. And I think these are all different ways in which we interact, and we ensure that the daily lived experiences do manifest properly, and the policies are not seen as designed or structured from a religious perspective, or indeed from any particular segment of society. Looking ahead, there are two, I think, broad things that we need to be careful about and do. One I alluded to, which is the lack of coming together on SMM because of SMMs, the inability to come together for services, for worship, for Sunday school. I think there is a significant social price that we pay, a psychological social price that we pay for this. And I think we have to begin to start looking at opening up in a way which allows us to bring people back together, to practice, to look at what we used to practice and to bring people back into a social setting. Safely, of course, but I think we have to do that because I mentioned this before, some of you may have heard me say this, when we curtail businesses and you can't operate for a period of time, there's you find that they naturally squeal. But it's quite easily and very often best fixed by putting in a financial package and help the business find its way along. But when you don't allow and you cut off people from worship, from church, from temples, from mosques, from social interactions, especially children, in a social setting, games, schools, CCAs, there is a deeper price that we might pay, which we may not fully appreciate now. And we might only realize that downstream. So we are in government looking at this very carefully. And I think many of you would know that PM is speaking tomorrow to really take stock of where we are on these measures, to look at how we can normalize many of these things that we've not been used to for a while, and to bring, as far as we can, back some sense of normalcy. Bearing in mind that there is still COVID, there are still strains on the hospital resources, healthcare workers are still really stretched. But I think we need to find a new paradigm, a new path forward. So one of the things that I'd like to talk to ROs about, not just in churches, but also the other religious organizations, is how we can encourage the safe resumption of religious practices in a post-COVID environment, in a more COVID-resilient society. The second thing that I think we need to do is, it's somewhat evergreen, but that really is to continue to strengthen our cohesion and building that social fabric week by week. It's evergreen because we've constantly been doing this since the day we started as a country. But I think we also need to come around to the realization that each generation will look at this cohesion differently. There'll be different paradigms and different ways of approaching a problem. Societal values may also change over time. And I think each generation, as I said earlier, will need to have a new compact. And we have to progressively and also sensitively look at our policies, programs, and see how relevant it is for new society. One thing we're doing is to update our RLCCs. RLCCs set up in 2002 in the aftermath of the 9/11 disaster, 9/11 atrocities. And so it served us well over 2 decades. And so we have been looking at how we can update the relevance of RLCCs in our community to ensure that they continue to be that local bridge that I spoke about. We have macro issues, we have macro structures, but we need to have these micro connectors as well on the ground, and RLCCs do play a part in that. So these are two of the issues that I think are immediately at our doorstep. I think over the next couple of weeks, these are going to be very important issues for us. I think I'll stop here and pass the time back to you, the moderator, and also to Bishop. I'm very happy to take questions and have a discussion later on with all of you. Thank you.